So let's look at another use case. Imagine that we have a service in our test path. So in this case, let's imagine that this UUID service is calling an external network or an external microservice. When we're running the test, we don't want that actual call to be made. So in this case, let's imagine that this UUID service.fetchUID is actually calling, let's say, an external service to fetch the UUID. In this case, I'm just returning this, but let's just imagine that that's the case. We don't want to do that in the test because when this Spring Boot test is running in a Spring Boot test application context, when it comes to this call here, it's going to try and call the external network. Let's say this is like an API is trying to hit, but that's probably going to fail because we don't have that running in the test. So instead, what we can do is that we can simulate this call here by mocking this UUID service bean, because as you can see here, it's a Spring bean. So we can do that by mocking this bean such that when this call is made, it just returns a dummy value and it does not actually make the call to the network. And that way we would have bypassed that obstacle that we're facing of calling an external service inside the test. And so, yes, like I said, we're going to use a MockBean annotation, which is part of the Mockito test framework. So here, all I've added is I added this at MockBean annotation, and this comes bundled in Spring Boot's test dependency. So if you come here and you look up, you see this is Spring Boot test, and this dependency is what I declared earlier here. So I didn't add anything from the previous video. It's exactly the same dependencies here. Now, once I've declared this MockBean, then I have to declare what conditions or what happens when the actual bean is called and what I should return. So here's where we do that. So you can see that it's saying that when the UID service.fetchUID method is called, then return this UID that I generated up here. So now when I run this test and it hits this line here, it's not going to call this method. Instead, it's just going to return this UID here, and then I'll just check to see that this UID that's returned is equal to what came back in the response, because that's what gets added to the DTO here. So let's go ahead and test that and see how it goes. Let me run the test in debug mode so that you can see how the beans are defined here in this class. So what I'm expecting is that this UID service bean is going to be a mocked bean, but this person repository bean will not be a mocked bean, it will be an actual bean, because we are not mocking it. The only bean I'm mocking is this UID service. So I've placed a breakpoint at this line. And so when it hits the line, I want to check this UID service bean and see what it is. And then I'll check this as well. Okay, so let's look at this. Let's evaluate it. And indeed, we see it's a mocked bean. And then when I come to the person repository and evaluate it, I see that it's an actual bean that is generated by the Spring Boot test application context. Let me finish running the test. Okay, and the test passes. So that means that our mock bean worked, because as one of our assertions here, we have that the UID that's returned from our call to this service should be equal to the UID that was passed into our mock bean return result here, which is this UID. So both of them match. So that means that this UID service mocking actually worked. In summary, anytime you want to mock Spring Beans in your test, use the MockBean annotation.